Introduce our two speakers for this afternoon's session. We met them all this morning, so you really can't say a whole lot more about them than what you already know. So very briefly, Graham Talley is the co-founder of Float On, a serial entrepreneur, and for the last 3 years has run a donation-based small business workshop called Cake. He has a degree in experimental psychology and a graduate certificate in theater, served on the board of the Float Tank Association, and has worked closely with several health departments throughout the U.S., and is no stranger to international facial hair competitions, as we learned. I can only dream. Graham does consulting with new float centers and with early-stage startups in general, has been speaking at conferences and universities on mental health, happiness, and small business for the past 8 years. And his cohort in crime, Ashkahn, or by his full legal name, I love this, Ashkahn Danger, Jahromi, helped found Float On after making his way up from Portland through California, earning a degree in theater along the way. He is a CPO and is on the NSF 50 Task Force for Sensory Deprivation. He also served on the board of the Float Tank Association and attended the World Beard and Mustache Competition in Norway again. He consults and does training with new and existing float centers and speaks regularly for universities and private organizations about floating and small business. Today's session will be on various disinfection options in float tanks. Let's welcome Graham and Ashkahn.
All right, thank you. All right, guys, how's everyone doing today? Excellent, excellent. So this talk is going to be a little more technical than our talk this morning. If you've been, sparked by the interest in float tanks from the little brief amount that we mentioned, we're going to dive even deeper into them and actually go into some of the actual sanitation, the newest kind of research that's going into it, the regulations, and all that good stuff that we're all here for. We gave a talk last year as well about the kind of current state of float tank sanitation research back then. Can I just see who here actually saw that talk last year? Okay, great. There's a few of you out there. Excellent. Well, we'll be kind of going through a few of the same things just in the beginning, kind of get everyone on the same page, and then we've actually just got some brand new research to share with you guys that literally just came in a few days ago. So you guys are on the cutting edge here. You'll be float tank experts in no time.
Great. So, what are float tanks? Is a good place to start. Float tanks, I always like to describe them as kind of a perfect bathtub, really, when you get down to it. So they're 4 feet wide, 8 feet long. There's about in half by the salt water. And all the water is then kept at skin temperature, which your external skin temperature is actually a little cooler than your internal skin temperature. So it's 93.5 degrees is what we keep the water of the tanks around. The rooms that we design are really soundproof. The pods themselves have some decent soundproofing in there. And the rooms are also light-proof. So once you turn off the light on the inside of the float tank, there's no light, no sound, no sense of touch, and almost no gravity on your body. And you just kind of float there weightlessly. There are many benefits, which we'll get into too. And as you can see going through these, the tanks really do come in just all different shapes and sizes, from kind of enclosed ones to open pools to clamshells, which we also showed a little earlier today.
I'm still really trying to find one of these in the world so I can float in it. It's like it's a dream of mine to find this clamshell tank out there somewhere.
Apparently they're impossible to get out of because of the slope and the slippery salt water. Once you try to crawl out, it's just...
Yeah, it turns out it's a terrible idea to make a float tank this shape. So why the heck do people even hop into these things? There's actually a kind of a whole slew of reasons that range from the physical to the mental. We have a lot of people coming in to float with us to deal with just physical pain relief. There's a lot of decompression that happens in these because of the amount of gravity that's kind of being reduced on your body. So back pain, neck pain, arthritis, anything with your joints. We get a lot of reports from our customers that they find a lot of pain relief when coming into float for a lot of those things. And if you don't have any injuries, often we hear people coming out and saying that it felt just kind of like a full body massage. And they're very loose and typically more flexible, and just kind of feel like your body got a mini vacation while you were in there.
Do you want to talk about more benefits? Or?
Yeah, there's the mental stuff too. It's one of the main reasons that people come in is that It's just incredibly relaxing. In terms of dealing with stress, your brain in there just doesn't have to process any of the outside world and not have to deal with any of that external stimulus. And as a result, your whole kind of fight or flight system just gets to chill out for a little bit. Production of adrenaline, cortisol, these kind of chemicals in your body that lead to stress or are a result of stress have been found to go way down while people are floating. And those effects last with people for anywhere from 1 to 3 days. People just kind of feel really mellow. We actually had someone call us about 3 days after their float, and they're just like, I don't know what you did to me, but I haven't been able to be angry for 3 days. And I'm always angry. Like, people cut me off in traffic, and I start yelling at them, and I just haven't been able to care about that anymore. So it's been, we get some interesting reports from people coming in, and really seeming to get a really nice, relaxing effect from it.
Yep, and although we're going to be talking a lot about the water sanitation side of things and the research that's going into that, there's also a lot of research being conducted right now into those benefits. Back in the 80s especially, there was a lot of what you'd consider, I guess, pilot studies into a lot of these benefits, which with maybe sample sizes of 20 participants to 40 or 60 participants, but nothing really that large scale. And just now, we're starting to see some of the first actual brain scans coming out from people floating. So there's a couple float tanks attached to a facility called the Laureate Institute for Brain Research that has 2 of the most advanced fMRI machines actually in the world just around the corner from the float tank. So they're sending people into the tanks and then doing brain scans right afterwards. And we have the first dozen people who have been going through those. And over the next 5 years especially, they've gotten grants for a lot of money to do a bunch of research out there. So we're just about to see some of the most advanced research in floating come out regarding these benefits. So feel free to ask questions afterwards if you're interested in that side of things too.
You can also just start to see crazy colors and visuals while you're in there, which is another fun part of it. We have customers who come out saying they saw swirling nebulas or gorillas riding surfboards or a woman just yelling at them in German and they didn't even know German. So it turns out without stimulation, your brain will just start to make up its own. So we get kind of the full spectrum of human beings coming through to float in our shop.
So just a really quick history to let you know where these things came from. They were invented, 1954 was actually the first float tank. And it was invented by this fellow up here, Dr. John C. Lilly, also known for dolphin-human communication, which is kind of interesting. And he was actually at the National Institute of Health is where the float tanks came out of. And back then they looked a little bit different than they do now. So there was no salt in the water. It was actually just fresh water. And you were fully submerged in it in order to get that kind of weightless feeling. And because they couldn't totally black things out there, they actually had a mask that was totally blacked out that would go over your head and a breathing tube coming out. And so there's an actual photo of someone in one of those original float tanks. And so that was pretty much the lab setting style float tank from 54 up through around 74 with some minor variations in between. But around the early 70s, you start to see those first lay down models of float tanks. And this is actually the very first released commercial float tank in 74. And that's also where you start to see this high saline content come in. Initially, it was just relatively fresh water. And John Lilly would do what he'd call dolphin breathing, where he'd bend his legs and lay in the water and just take really deep breaths so that his torso would stay buoyant in there. And then they started pumping salt water in there from the ocean. And from there, they just went to full saturation with sodium chloride, which stung a lot. So they switched from sodium chloride over to magnesium sulfate. And that's in 74 when you see this first design of the Samadhi float tank. And from then, it's really branched out. So there was one commercial manufacturer then. Today in the world, there's probably around, what, 30?
35 maybe?
Yeah, and in the US, around 12 manufacturers just here in the States.
So at this point, you're probably wondering how the heck we managed to talk these people into letting us talk about float tanks here. And it turns out that the float industry is actually just exploding right now, despite the fact that it's been around for so long and even had a kind of little ebb and flow in the 80s. We're seeing, especially in the last 4 to 5 years or so, just kind of an explosion with float tanks. A lot here in the United States. There's probably about 300 float centers around the US at this point. Canada is close behind in terms of their growth. We're seeing lots of centers popping up in places like Vancouver and Toronto. Vancouver at this point probably has more float tanks per capita than any city in the world. Places like Australia, we're starting to see it pop up in Asia, and overall, just the number of centers that are kind of coming around are really just increasing at an exponential rate.
And to give you an idea, that's up from, 5 years ago, there were maybe under 100 float tank centers that were actually active in the US, and probably only about 5 to a dozen that were up in Canada. And yeah, it's just been exploding over the last 5 years especially. You're seeing an exponential growth of maybe 30 to 50% growth in the industry year over year.
We actually take a survey of the industry. We've only done it 2 years now, but it's it's still kind of a young industry, so that's like 10 years in float years. But this is from our last kind of years of data in terms of float centers that are opening or that have opened, and you can just see that huge, steep incline. And 2015 actually only goes up through August in terms of the data here. So there's the rest of the months of the year that'll tack on top of that.
And the size of existing centers as well is interesting. So this is from our industry report that we put out. And the data from the previous year, too, is kind of interesting. You actually start to see this rise of, last year we saw way more even 1 to 2 tank centers than we see up here. And a lot of those are attached to spas or other wellness kind of practices as well. But much more of a rise in 3 to 4 tank centers, and especially we're seeing more and more larger ones in the 5 to 11 tanks opening. Within the last month, actually, there was an 11 tank center that opened down in LA, which makes it now the largest float tank center in the world, just opened very recently.
And in terms of the future, we're just seeing this trend continue. We take surveys of prospective centers as well, and you can see that there's just a huge amount of people planning on opening. So, these are just the people who filled out our survey. And if you can imagine, say half of them are totally never actually going to make it, that's still an incredible growth in people who are planning on opening in the next year or two.
So that's just an overview of the industry, kind of the lay of the land as far as what to expect largely, which means that float tanks are on the rise, and you're going to be seeing them more and more, and hopefully popping into them more and more yourselves. But there are some basic differences between float tanks and pools and spas in general. And yep, some of those are that we have just a single bather load. So we only have one person going in at a time, which is obviously very different. You're not as worried about immediate cross-contamination as a result of that. You go in nude, so no bathing suits on you, anything like that. So you're not bringing in extra bacteria from that. Same with detergents, anything that's carried in on your suits, kind of eliminated, which is nice. You shower before and after, pretty mandatorily, like even more, I know you're supposed to shower before and after you go into a swimming pool or a hot tub, but I think that anyone who operates one might tell you how hard it is to get every single person to actually follow those procedures. In a float tank room, the typical layout is with the shower directly outside of the float tank door. And the usual flow is dressing room, right into the shower, directly into the float tank, and then right back out again. My guess is that close to 100% of our clients end up showering and taking anywhere from a 5 to 15-minute shower before they actually get into the tank, and afterwards as well, although that's less important for the water sanitation.
You're actually not, you're also not active in the float tank, so as opposed to a swimming pool where you're swimming laps and sweating and all that stuff, that kind of bathe load is being released. You're in temperature neutral water, and you're typically lying there doing nothing. So there's kind of very little physical exertion that can lead to sweat and things like that getting into the float water.
Yep, very low risk of swallowing the water, both because it just tastes awful. If you get even a drop in your mouth, you will immediately regret it. And also just because, again, you're floating right on the surface and you're not really splashing around. Obviously not doing laps, you're not submerging your head under the water. Your mouth is really above it the entire time. So the risk of it actually kind of entering your mouth and your digestive tract is incredibly low.
And we're also dealing with water that's often a lot shallower than we're seeing in these other kind of aquatic systems. 11 inches is kind of the max. Our tanks usually bounce between about 10, 11 inches as we're going through our course of floating people throughout the week.
Yeah, which is interesting. It means that there's a kind of a larger surface area per volume than you see for most other applications.
One of the biggest ones that's different for us is just the requirements we need to run our floats properly, to make things soundproof and to give that kind of low stimulus experience. We can't run our pumps during our floats. They're loud, they would swoosh the water around, you'd just be kind of spinning around in there. And so instead of a continuous filtration, which is kind of the norm for so many other systems, we actually have our systems completely shut off while someone's floating in there. And then when they hop out, we do like a very aggressive filtration, typically 3 to 4 turnovers in a matter of 15 minutes.
And the float tank plumbing is all self-contained as well, and usually just attached to the back of the float tank. So all of our float tanks, rather than have kind of a separate pump equipment room, usually all of the pump equipment is just in that private room along with the shower and the float tank and the dressing area. And so all in our center, all 6 of our tanks have their own plumbing system attached, and that's by far the most common setup that you see.
Probably the biggest thing that's different between these and other systems is just the sheer amount of Epsom salt that's in the water. It really is a game changer. You know, we're saturating this water with salt, and it leads to a lot of differences, not just in chemistry, but in our own actual operational practices and how we need to deal with that water. The water is extremely corrosive, so we can't use a lot of regular pool equipment. We can't use typical metals. We need high-grade stainless steel or titanium or plastics. Mechanical pumps often break on us. We have to get these special magnetically driven pumps. So there's a lot of just kind of dealing with the fact that they break down our equipment on top of the fact that they pretty much break down everything in our store and destroy our shoes and follow us home at night and end up in our pockets and kind of drive us a little bit crazy.
Another thing the salt does, which is kind of wild, is it just makes it the water a lot more slippery than usual. Even deck material that's designed for use on boats in the ocean, you can get salt water on there and just hydroplane. We've kind of made a game of whenever we have to make a new room, we always try to look at new materials that are coming out, and we've gotten just these incredibly almost like grooved tiles and thrown salt water on it, and still you can really slip on very unexpectedly still rough surfaces. We've really had to put a lot of work into finding those materials that are anti-skid and won't let you slide out on the float tank water.
The salt also makes the solution very expensive. We're talking about $400 to $500 worth of salt sitting inside of these tanks. So if you hit something like in a pool where the solution is, oh, drain some water out, or let's dump this out and kind of refill it, those are a lot more difficult decisions for us to make economically when we're talking about every gallon of our water being so expensive.
Magnesium sulfate also just has a really strong impact on water chemistry in general. We'll talk about kind of the individuals coming up here, but we've been sending saltwater samples out to various labs, Lamont, Taylor, Hawk, trying to get samples and see what what the salt actually does to different pH, alkalinity testing, things like that, even down to chlorine and bromine testing. And a lot of the results that we've been getting back show that we're not really sure that we're getting accurate readings of those things in the float tank. Having 250,000 parts per million magnesium sulfate is not what any of the testing equipment was really designed for. And while we think that we're getting accuracy with some things, like hydrogen peroxide, for example, pH, alkalinity, those ones we're a lot more certain of.
And this is kind of a good just lesson in terms of a lot of what it's like running a float tank center is we can't even trust our test equipment. We have to test our test equipment. And even when we do that, companies are like, yeah, we have no idea, like, good luck, We're like, okay, do you know of anybody who makes anything for this? It's just it's a solution that I haven't seen used in any other industry, not from agriculture to anything. So there's very few tools that are actually specifically made or calibrated for this.
And last year when we were presenting, we asked for anyone who does manufacture testing equipment or work closely in that vein to let us know if they're interested in trying to work with us or if they have any ideas about how to get accurate readings in the float tanks. And we followed up with several of those from last year and still have not had much luck, especially with things like alkalinity. So if anyone else here would like to take a crack at that, please come up and talk to us afterwards. We would love to chat with you.
Yeah, please help us. We measure the salt levels in our water using specific gravity is the most typical measurement you're going to see a float center using. This is a measurement of relative densities. So 1 is water. So anything above 1 is heavier than water, and anything lower than 1 is lighter than water. So we put salt up to typically somewhere you're going to find centers in that 1.25 to 1.3 range in terms of specific gravity. And 1.31, 1.32 is pretty much saturation point at the temperature that we're at. So we're hovering really, really close to that point where literally salt will no longer dissolve and will just start crystallizing out of the water. And this affects us too, having your liquid just spontaneously turn to solid in your pumps and through various parts of your system also creates engineering challenges that most equipment isn't built for.
And then pH, like we mentioned, is a little bit difficult to measure. It is very internally consistent, which is good. So we know that if we add a certain amount of pH plus, it's going to go up a certain amount. If we take a reading of in the 7.0 range, in the morning, it's probably going to be in that 7.0 range at night. It doesn't shift around too terribly much, but again, ultimately, after all of our conversations with labs and going through many different types of test kits, which right now we use DPD test kits. Reagent from Taylor, I think is what we're using right now. But even after all of that, we're still not sure that, although they're consistent, they're valid at all, and that we are getting the accurate range in those measurements.
And you kind of have to start to think with things like pH and things that you would have just a natural assumption for in a pool or a spa, how that actually translates into a float system. We use hydrogen peroxide and UV as our main form of sanitation, which we'll get into a little bit later. But when you start thinking about our systems running on that, we don't have chlorine or bromine, and so the pH levels kind of affecting the potency of the chlorine is not a concern for us. In terms of bather comfort and getting water in your eye and having pH be that nice, comfortable range, float tank water in your eye is not going to be any more comfortable if it happens to be in that nice pH range. If you are worried about the water being too corrosive for your pump system with a pH that's a little too acidic, that stuff will never last in a float tank. The salt would have destroyed it years ago. So we already have this really industrial equipment that's not going to care about fluctuations in pH to that degree. And you kind of start stacking all these things up together and you're like, okay, well, why would we keep pH in that kind of same range as a pool or a spa? And we honestly don't know. And maybe there are other reasons out there that people haven't figured out yet. But we also have no idea of what a better range to keep pHs in. There are no studies on what the best pH range for a saturated Epsom salt solution is. So we find ourselves continuously falling back on kind of pool and spa norms, but in the back of our heads being like, oh, why are we doing this again? And it's just, you really have to question things even as fundamental as the pH balance of your water.
From there, alkalinity actually falls into a very similar kind of category. Again, it's very internally consistent, and it tends to go up more than down in float tanks, which means that often it gets harder and harder to adjust our pH with the alkalinity. That said, alkalinity of everything that we've tested seems to be the most troublesome, even for the manufacturers of testing equipment, to really get a beat on. It's one of the ones that I'm the least confident in, that we're actually getting accurate alkalinity readings.
Water hardness typically also includes measurement for magnesium. So that one's pretty much bunk for us. We pretty much get off the chart results every time we do that. Yeah. We also just don't really typically see issues of scaling and things like that in float tanks. I've read a few things about magnesium helping break down calcium deposits, and again, not a huge amount of research that we have to be able to back this stuff up on, but at least anecdotally, haven't seen any issues of scaling in our center or in any other centers that we've seen open around the country.
Total dissolved solids, again, very similar. It's not typically measured just because the total dissolved solids is at least 250,000 parts per million in the float tank simply by adding in all of that salt.
Clarity too, while we do think it's important for our water to be clean and clear for a lot of reasons, you start to think about some of the reasons that pools are doing it in order to see all the way to the bottom to prevent drowning and various reasons like that don't actually make sense in a float tank that has 10 inches of liquid in it.
So much more a sign of just general water quality. And if you're a health regulator, you're going in and actually inspecting different health tanks, anything like that, definitely the water should always be crystal clear. If there's anything cloudy going on there, then just like in a pool, something's going wrong with the water sanitation. There's not something special about the salt where you'll see it kind of manifest or turn the water cloudy unless, again, something's going wrong.
We keep the temperature typically somewhere in this range, 92 to 95, but usually a lot more specifically controlled in the 93.5 to 94.5 range. So we're higher in temperature than pools, but lower than hot tubs, and kind of in that in-between range.
It's interesting too, because it's almost, it's getting very close to a wet bulb environment, or getting close to that 100% humidity. So actually, when your head is in the water, submerged in float tanks, going above about 96 can actually cause overheating. So similarly, if you're ever going and inspecting float tanks, make sure that that temperature is down below that 96 mark and isn't creeping up, or that people are trying to maintain the float tanks like hot tubs, because they can get much more quickly dangerous than in other environments.
And like we said, you know, the water is very shallow. If you try to put a float tank into a regular pool code, you often come across things like needing lifeguards on duty and no diving signs. And we've been told this before, and we're just kind of like, are you listening to what you're saying right now? Because that's kind of absurd. So yeah, it's typically a pretty tough fit when you're trying to just kind of put these into the existing mold.
Chlorine and bromine is a huge topic in our industry, and probably one of the most controversial, at least in dealing with different health departments in various states. As I think Ashkahn mentioned earlier, we're not regulated in Oregon, and we choose to use hydrogen peroxide and ultraviolet light attached to our pump system and the filter for disinfection. Other states like Washington or up in Vancouver, Canada, require chlorine or bromine use inside the float tanks. And we just have some serious reservations about that, not just Ashkahn and I, but as a whole industry, largely because of the disinfection byproducts and them hanging out just above the surface of the water. And again, when you're floating, you're about cut in half by the water, so your mouth and nose are just within a couple inches of that surface of the water, which is largely where the trichloramines and other disinfection byproducts like to hang out. And we haven't actually run tests on it, and we aren't aware of the damage that is caused by that, but we have serious reservations about throwing in chlorine and bromine and the long-term effects for both the float tank operators and for our customers as to what that might do. And we'll take some questions at the end as well.
Another thing that is just important to keep in mind is that centers, you know, like us, we have 6 float tanks. So adding some sort of device or even a robust kind of ventilation system or these kind of more industrial scale things, we have to do in multiples. If we find like a nice little thing to attach to our pump system, we have to do it across 6 systems. And the economics of getting these big kind of industrial things that many times over becomes really difficult for these kind of float centers to support.
Hydrogen peroxide UV is one of the most preferred methods of sanitation for the float tank industry. And again, this is what we choose to use. We typically dose our hydrogen peroxide up to 100 parts per million. It's relatively volatile. We end up usually only having to add hydrogen peroxide once per day, and it rarely drops below the 50 parts per million range. I'm typically, actually hovering more in the 60 to 75 range at the lowest, and then popping back up. You can kind of see that's every single dip in that graph is checking it at night and adding more hydrogen peroxide to bring it up. So the dips are pretty much how much it drops over the course of a day, bringing it back up, and then it dropping over the next day.
There are some float tanks that use ozone and UV as their kind of system of sanitation. Again, this is possible to not have a residual in the water because you are doing those turnovers between people, and you don't really have to worry as much about that cross-contamination with that robust filtration that's happening between each person. Ozone obviously still comes with the concern about air quality, which is one of the reasons why peroxide UV seems to be a very preferred method across the industry, is that amongst all these sanitizers, that's kind of one of the only ones where you don't have to be too concerned about that small, enclosed area that people are floating in for long periods of time.
So what's the current state of regulations for float tanks? Really mixed is the answer. Some states have totally deregulated them. Some counties have decided that they are deregulating them and just not going to go and supervise them. Others have tried to wedge them into pool and spa code, granting a bunch of variances. Others still have tried to make their own specific guidelines and operation standards for float tanks. Sometimes that they're attempting to push into code, sometimes that are just guidelines for the operators as to how the health departments would like to see them function. And that's true not just in the US and various states, that's also true up in Canada. Pretty much all of the different provinces have different regulations regarding float tanks, and right now they're kind of going back and forth, and a lot of different states and provinces in the US and Canada are kind of swapping notes and talking amongst themselves, where they have a bunch of float tanks that are opening in the various jurisdictions. And yeah, you kind of see this evolution of one area or one province finds something out, and then a state down here in the States will adopt its regulations, and another province up in Canada will start adopting it. So it's very much in this state of flux right now, and there isn't really any consistency between what you see from, again, even county to county. Much more in the past. I think even last year we were talking about how some areas were outright forbidding float tanks to open, at least commercially. And that's one thing that, at least in the last year, has really changed. We haven't really heard any reports of that. It seems much more that the harshest thing that happens is they get really just wedged into that pool and spa code definitively and are forced to use chlorine and bromine. But I don't think I've heard of anyone in the last year who's actually been completely turned down from opening it all.
And really more than anything, we're seeing a trend towards health departments kind of taking on the task of creating those custom regulations and those rules specifically tailored to float tanks. I think people are starting to get more and more calls about people hoping to open. At least when we talk to different health department people here, it's much more frequent that they're like, oh yeah, no, is there someone opening up in my county? And I think there's kind of a growing understanding that this is coming, and that something is hopefully going to need to be set up to handle the number of centers that are going to be opening more and more each year.
So, gosh, a few years ago now?
Yeah.
We helped to draft the US float tank standard. You can see our names up there. And this has been used as a guideline. It actually, we have offered for free along with a bunch of other resources just on water quality and what we've found so far from our research into float tanks online for any new centers to download. This ends up being a pretty good guideline for just the basics of what makes sense for operating a float tank according to the heads of the industry. Gwyn Perry up there, you'll see too, he invented the first commercial float tank. Shoshana Liebner's been very active in research, and David Wasserman is another one of the major US manufacturers. And yeah, just kind of, after banging our heads together again a few years ago, this is the standard that we came up with and released.
So we're seeing some stuff happening within the industry to kind of, fill this vacuum. We're also seeing the kind of other parts of the aquatics industry start to pay attention and do things for float tanks. The NSF a few years ago created a task group pointed towards actually creating a standard for the manufacturing of flotation tanks, which will, is on the path right now to being adopted into NSF 50. It's still just being developed, and all those conference calls to figure everything out. We've have conversations with the Model Aquatic Health Code. It seems like some health department people would be really interested in having a model code that they could just pull from, especially to fill, not to butt heads with whatever you have currently, but just to literally fill a completely blank spot in regulations. So that's a potential future that we could see float tank regulations in a model code like that, and have it kind of a more unified thing spread around and be easier to adopt for people.
And of course, even just being out at events like this, the World Aquatic Health Conference. And we're now getting invited out to more events than this to go speak at different both aquatic health events and just pool management events as well, to kind of generate a little more awareness, since, again, float tanks are nothing but on the rise currently.
So a lot of what we've talked about is just this kind of lack of information, and that's been something that the industry definitely recognizes. And so we've been recently able to start some efforts within the float industry to really try to generate some data. And when someone says, "Hey, I'd like to use hydrogen peroxide in UV," and a health department says, "Do you have any data to show that that's safe?" We're working towards trying to make that answer yes, and actually generate that data for float tank water. We mentioned this morning that we helped start the Float Fund, where we gather funds, and have recently, just in the last few months, been working with the NSF to run our very first test with that funding. And the first thing we wanted to do was just get a baseline of Epsom salt without any other sanitizer, just see, hey, this water with Epsom salt in it, just by itself, how does that react differently than, what we're used to with pools and hot tubs?
And so we organized baseline testing. We just tried out with a very simple design methodology. So 3 sample points with some shaking in between. So we introduced some bugs, Pseudomonas and Enterococcus were the 2 that we ended up using. And we tested at the 0 time, at 1 hour, and then again at 24 hours. And we were shaking every hour for 15 minutes for the first 12 hours, and then let it stagnate for 12 hours, did one last shake, and then did that final sample point at the 24-hour mark. And that was to simulate how float centers are usually run, which is usually a 45-minute long, hour-long float, 15 minutes of the pump cycle running, and then the 12 hours of stagnation at the end was to simulate that nighttime when you might close and you're not necessarily running the pump systems.
And we did this with a control as well, so we could see how just distilled water reacted to these two bacteria. And here are the results. We literally got these about 2 days ago, so this is kind of brand new information that's coming out. But you can see here, and it's a little easier to see on this graph, but we have the Enterococcus stayed pretty much the same. So here it is, that's working there, on the control, so just the regular water at time 0, 1 hour, and 24 hours. And the same thing with the salt water. So we're seeing pretty much the no effect from the salt water on that specifically. But if you look at the Pseudomonas, there's actually a kind of dramatic difference between what we're seeing there. We have the control on the is the first one that you see there at time 0, 1, and 24, and there was actually an increase in Pseudomonas. And the next one over, you can see just a huge drop. So even at 1 hour, it's a significant drop. And by the 24-hour mark, it had basically gone a full 6 logs down, which hit just below detectable levels.
Yeah.
So at some point between 1 hour and 24 hours, that had dropped all the way down to lower than the threshold that they were able to test for.
And so functionally, of course, you're always going to have to use disinfection methods inside the float tank. The salt water alone is never going to be enough. Even with the Pseudomonas, it's unless you can actually kill the bugs within 15 minutes that it takes to cycle the person out, then that's never going to be disinfection enough. So this is much more, I guess, to just establish that the salt water is a more hostile environment to a lot of those bacteria, a lot of those pathogens that could cause problems for our customers. But again, you're always going to have to use disinfection methods as well. And we talked to the lab as well about the reasons that we might be seeing this resistance from the Enterococcus versus the Pseudomonas. And a couple things came up, being gram-positive versus gram-negative, just thicker cell walls in the case of the Enterococcus versus the Pseudomonas. And then also the fact that apparently Enterococcus is just salt-resistant in general, even growing in salt agars will tend to thrive in those. And similarly seems to have a kind of defense mechanism where it will actually secrete different solutions and protect its own cells with that, which Pseudomonas doesn't do. So a little bit stronger of a bug there. And
this is a very rudimentary study. It was done on a shaker table, but it was just some information to really get us going. This is just a fun sciencey picture the NSF sent over to make us seem a little more scientific when we're giving this presentation. But this is the beginning of a path that we're hoping to go on and that we're raising funds for. And from here, we really want to take those same tests and actually set up a as best we can kind of a generic float system that we could make a little bit more realistic to real life and start doing tests with hydrogen peroxide and UV and compare how effective those are. And the more money we raise, the more funding or the more research we can actually start doing with ozone and actually starting to really test those air quality issues that we're kind of theoretically concerned about with chlorine and bromine, and see if we can quantify some of the stuff that a lot of people have in their minds as their concerns.
And so a similar call for help from the audience too. We've done a lot to generate awareness and actually raise a decent amount of funds, which we still have some in reserve for running extra tests down this avenue. But if any of you have advice for either grants, other funding, or even nonprofits to go through to kind of funnel the money through. Right now we have our main organization, the Float Tank Association, is a 501c6 nonprofit, which means that it doesn't get donations tax deductible. So we are looking for a tax deductible water nonprofit to pair up with to kind of funnel some of our funds through as well, just to gather more donations from the industry. So again, if any of you have any tips on that, we'd be happy to chat afterwards as well.
We're also seeing just research on many other aspects of float tanks starting to become realized in a much larger way. Like Graham was mentioning, the Laureate Institute for Brain Research, which now has the Float Clinic and Research Center in it, is starting a study on transdermal magnesium absorption. So, soaking in Epsom salts and how much magnesium you actually absorb, which surprisingly there's like almost no information on, despite the fact that people have been soaking in Epsom salts for hundreds of years. So we're starting to see that happen. Again, actually results with fMRI machines, hopefully eventually leading to full-on inpatient clinical studies using float tanks and having those be peer-reviewed and basically having data out there in a kind of more robust way than we've seen in the past.
Yep, and with that magnesium absorption too, they're actually doing blood samples that are being sent off to the Mayo Clinic, and all of the funding has been secured for that one, which is great, largely from the Magnesium Council?
The Epsom Salt Council.
Epsom Salt Council, yeah, the Epsom Salt Council, which is unsurprising since it's mostly magnesium.
So to kind of go over everything real fast, one just important thing to remember is that we're dealing with a different liquid. It's easy to think of this as water, but through just the functional operational procedures we need to do and through some of the actual quantifiable data that we've been able to pull, this is a different solution. It's really not water, and as such it requires some different thoughts and some different rules.
Float tanks are just expanding quickly. It really is amazing how many new ones are opening up, and even the volume of calls that we get and the number of free downloads that we get for people just seeking information and wanting to find out more about the industry is doing nothing but rising. And same with the number of people going into those float centers. Although there are more and more opening up, we hear of almost none that are closing down. And in fact, if anything, they seem to be getting busier and busier. So not only the number of centers, but the number of floaters going through seems to be increasing over time. So this doesn't seem to be an industry that's going away, and on the contrary, it seems to be doing nothing but growing at an exponential rate.
And this is really the beginning. Like, we just have so many questions that we still need to answer. We still can't even really measure the basic water chemistry inside of our systems with a lot of confidence, let alone know, how any of the data we hear at this conference translates into this Epsom salt solution. And hopefully, as we go forward in time, we can develop that and find more information and work to get more code language and some better kind of foundation going for all these different mysteries that we have yet to solve.
And one nice thing is that we haven't heard, despite kind of being a little bit confused about this water chemistry, and with the level of sanitation that we're doing, we haven't heard of any outbreaks, even any incidents reported from float tank centers from not only the US, but Canada and any of the other countries that we go back and forth with and chat with as well. So it seems to be, at the very least, well maintained within the industry, which is very nice and comforting at least.
And lastly, go float yourself. Try it out. It's very much an experience-based thing, and we can sit up here and tell you all about it, but it's really not going to be even close to what you're going to learn from hopping into a float tank. There's hundreds of them around the country at this point. If you just type in float tank in your city, you'll likely find one, and we really encourage you to go try it out. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, guys. Any questions for him? Yes. Let me come to you. Start with you. You're close. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a regulator. Do you guys think that you should be regulated or want to be regulated?
Absolutely. I mean, I guess there's two levels there. We'd love to be regulated intelligently, and honestly, being in Oregon, we do a lot, even for new float centers opening in our city, to go and personally train them and make sure that they know how to take care of their water and be sanitary. It's terrifying, especially in an industry so young, the thought that someone could mess up and just not even know how to take care of the salt water and not change their filters or not throw any disinfection in there and just kind of think that they'd slap float tanks in a room and that's how you run a center. And that can ruin it really for the entire industry. So the idea of having standards, of having people come in and actually, again, intelligently monitor the centers sounds great. The part of it that's a little more, I guess, iffy is when those water sanitation guidelines stray towards, again, we've had people who actually have to submit variances for not having a lifeguard on duty, for not having no diving signs. And at that point, it just seems like, I mean, yeah, I've heard of places having to spend money on up to 27 variances just to get open, so that they're wedged into pool and spa codes. And at that point, the regulation seems like more of a hindrance than it is a help to the industry. So I think that there is a really nice point in there where the regulators understand and are working with our industry at large to know how to properly regulate them. And at that point, yes, I would love to have more regulation.
And one thing you'll find with float tank people in the industry is that they're very hungry for information. They're very participatory. I mean, the calls we have with the NSF and with these different states that are actually trying to adopt code, there's like 20 float tank people on every one of those calls because everyone is really interested in getting information. And one of the most common things we get is people saying like, are there just guidelines I can look at that tells me exactly how to do this safely? So yeah, it is just that double-edged sword. If they're done well, I think a lot of people would appreciate them. And if they're not done well, then that really just hurts us as a business to try to get open and bring this to the people.
Anyone else? Excuse me.
In regards to float tank patron control, what do you do regarding the individual that would come in with boils, rash, skin rashes, cuts? Is that strictly for the individual user to maintain, or would that affect the quality of the float?
Yeah, and that's one of the areas where definitely if someone has, a rash or some kind of skin condition, most float centers, almost all of them, will have some kind of waiver that they sign to say that that's not the case, that they don't have communicable diseases, that they're not suffering from a rash currently. It's also one of the areas where float tanks really kind of self-regulate for that. If you hop into the float tank, all of that salt water, if you have even a tiny cat scratch, you will definitely feel that. So the nice thing is that, yeah, for most kind of especially external conditions like that, the float tank almost excludes you getting in. You'd hop in for 30 seconds and immediately have to get out of that tank again just because it would sting too much. Does that answer your question?
Any control for any communicable diseases?
Again, with that waiver, yes, and hopefully that residual and other disinfection controls for people who might not be aware that they even have them.
You had mentioned the standards and whatnot, and you're right, you go into a search engine and just type in float tanks or something like that, and you'll come up with a lot. But you did talk about the U.S. Float Tank Association and the float tank standards. Where would folks find those?
So you can download those from the Float Tank Association website, which is just flotation.org. And you can also find them on our website as well. We have a website called Float Tank Solutions. And that has a free download that's just kind of called the Health Department Essentials or Water Quality Essentials. And you can download our recommendations along with the float tank standards there.
It also includes a lot of those how other states have decided to, go about handling float tanks. So a lot of the letters float centers have received from their health departments in terms of where they fit under regulations, we kind of bundled in there.
Anyone else? I'll come back to you, but let me speak on behalf of Taylor, obviously. We've worked with the gentleman up there after their presentation last year, and it's a tough nut to try and crack as far as trying to take care of the interferences and at least be able to find a way to comfortably and economically be able to test the tanks on a regular basis. It is an ongoing thing. We've been working with them for a while. I know a couple of the other test kit manufacturers are doing the same, so we will get there. There is a point at which we will be able to accurately test everything possible, but for right now, it's a little difficult, but we're working on it. So I guess a little patience is needed. Back here.
Hi, what would you do in the case of a fecal accident?
So that's a good question. We actually just had our first one in 5 years at our center just a few months ago. And what we ended up doing was draining the entire tank and flushing out the entire, obviously, changing out the filters, throwing those away, flushing out the entire system with bleach, reflushing it out with water to get the bleach out of there, and then refilling up the entire system with a fresh batch of water.
So we kind of just go really extreme, We can look at the CDC guideline and go, okay, like how should we translate this for float tanks? And ultimately, a lot of the times when we face decisions where we don't really have good information to stand on, we just try to go as conservative as we can, and we just dump the $500 worth of water, and we go as best as we can, just because it seems like the safest thing to do.
And unfortunately, it happens rare enough. If that were a more frequent occurrence, then yeah, perhaps going with more like the CDC recommended guidelines for that would be better. But even just being able to tell our customers that that's what we do and that's the level that we go to if we do have an accident is yeah, nice from the marketing and from the safety perspective.
Anyone else? Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it.
Please email us if you have any questions. We're always